a note, coming to you to hopefully say yes. So just a bit of housekeeping. Please remain muted. It would be great if you could put any questions or observations in the chat box. And at different parts of the webinar, my colleague Trevor and myself will pick those up. And then at the end, we will, have opportunities for people to ask physical questions at the end. So the webinar is sort of split broadly into two elements. Trevor will give an overview of the sort of key guts of the survey and what we found, and then I will, come in at the end with some sort of 14 or so key, conclusions. So this webinar is, been brought to you by UCA, University of Creative Arts. And in fact, what I should say is that the original funding for the research we did was completed or came from the Special Projects Fund from Research England. So, and this particular study was really to look into the future. It was a bit of strategic funding that enabled myself at UCA to really look into the future on the creative industries, particularly looking at sustainability in Industry 4.0. Although in the Foresight studies, we picked up on a lot of more cross-cutting issues as well. So, one of the conclusions that we coming out of the study is the sector is obviously built on creativity, but actually is it innovative? So the presenters today are myself and then Dr. Trevor Davis, who we cooperated with in this study, bringing in all his fantastic expertise on looking into the future. So the agenda for today is the welcome, then a bit of background, the key findings, a little case study on Createch. Then there's some Q&A that we'll pick up from the chat box. I will finalize with some conclusions and policy making, and then we'll end up with some Q&A. So again, as I mentioned, this particular webinar is a second webinar, that's really bringing out those findings and conclusions from a study that is available online. It really was looking out to 2030 using Foresight techniques, particularly looking at sustainability and Industry 4.0. But as I mentioned, we also picked up a number of cross-cutting issues. So the research was undertaken between January and April. We had two physical Foresight workshops covering sustainability in Industry 4.0. The last one being on the 6th of March, when a number of us were asking, did you see anybody in the tube with masks on? So, the study came out just as we were entering into lockdown, and in a sense, it has highlighted actually many issues that many of us will be familiar with. But now we're coming out of, in a slow form from the top of the peak, a number of the, in a sense, positive conclusions that we came out may become more relevant. So what I will do now is pass across to Trevor, and Trevor is going to give, an overview of the key findings.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you, Martin. First of all, just a quick bit of background on me. I come from a performance family, mostly musicians, but my career really for the last 30 years has gone in a completely different direction, into research, futurism, and working with the creative teams in R&D and agencies that are helping the big brands out there in the world, like Unilever, for example, And typically what I was doing was helping them with sustainable innovation. The other side of my career has been in artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and new technologies like blockchain with IBM as one of their distinguished engineers. So I bring kind of these two different sides to the research. So we conducted this brief study between January and March of this year using a mixture of desk research, interviews, and workshops. And we set out to envisage what the creative industries in the UK could look like in 2030 and what role sustainability in Industry 4.0 might play. And as Martin said, in the interim, the COVID-19 pandemic has turned up, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in terms of what it means for our findings. Next slide, please, Martin. Definitions are important in this area. So first of all, sustainability means for us both the triple bottom line, so environmental, economic and social, and also the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or the UN SDGs. And when we talk about Industry 4.0, we're really talking about smart production facilities based on technologies such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, robotics, automation, those kind of things. And then the slide that you should be looking at the moment is our definition of the verticals or subsectors of the creative industries that we use for our study. And I think the one that I'll just point to, because it is going to be important a bit later on, is the one number 5, which is this new area called Createch. More on that later. And its related area, which is really IT, software and computer services for the sector. Next slide, please. So let's start with some forward-looking projections. Prior to the pandemic and lockdown, our models were suggesting that the UK creative industries were set to grow possibly up to 3 times faster than the rest of the economy and would reach a gross value add, or GVA, of around 300 billion by 2030. So this is a substantial increase of 180 billion compared to 2020. And it means that the sector would amount for about 10% of the UK GDP in 2030. So it's bigger than aerospace and defense. So even if you factor in a couple of pandemic scenarios, then you could end up with a pretty good outcome. Now, what we have done since the pandemic, next slide please, is to rerun our models. So the top line here is the model that I've just shown you, which is our baseline. And if we then look at the impact of COVID, then this could be a £38 billion drop in GVA in 2020 alone. So that's the what you should be seeing as the kind of greeny blue line with the triangles. So that's the kind of the worst case scenario. And we've assumed in this that Createch will still continue to grow about 10 times faster than the sector average. So it's Createch that's kind of pulling the sector back up quicker. You may have seen a recent Oxford Economics report, which had revenues declining by 74 billion. So let me just do a quick comparison. 38 billion drop in GVA is an equivalent of 62 billion drop in revenues in our model. So we're saying 62, Oxford Economics saying 74 down. And I think the reason we're a little bit more optimistic is that it reflects the sector's ability to be creative in addressing what we're thinking of as the new normal. However, I think there are challenges with estimating even the current and future size of the sector. And then you have the pandemic introducing some new uncertainties about how revenues will be accrued. And of course, there's the knock-on impact of employment, which we have not looked at. Next slide, please. The one after this, Martin. So as part of this study, we did some rather nice machine learning work on publicly available documents. looking at the trends which are specific to the creative industries. And what you can see is the major trends that we picked up from our literature review here. And I'm just going to concentrate on a subset today because I think they reveal a great deal about how the sector might actually change over the next decade. And I think first and foremost, it is very clear that people are finding and looking for new ways to tell stories. And the trend is for ongoing improvement in immersive narratives in particular. And this is associated with mixed reality technologies such as augmented reality and virtual reality and simulations. Secondly, it seems clear that most people in the creative industries are experiencing advanced technologies such as AI and robotics as standalone applications. But by 2030, the expectation is that many of these Industry 4.0 technologies will have converged and they're going to be embedded into the equipment and processes that we use every day. And so people won't probably even know they're there. Thirdly, the literature review revealed an expectation that several of the creative industry subsectors will have decarbonized or achieved net zero or be very close to it by 2030. So a tremendous kind of achievement. Hence, the sustainability agenda will move on. And we think it's going to move on to areas such as biodiversity and obviously the circular economy. And then the final one I'll just highlight on this slide are the rapid developments of collaboration and co-creation norms. And I guess the pandemic and lockdown has given us a big taste of this. Again, adding to what we're starting to think of as some kind of new normal. In fact, calls like this one on Zoom are a very good example. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do now is dig down into some of the highlights from the workshops and the interviews that we performed. And here are the kind of top line findings that I'm going to step through in the next section of the presentation. And I think there's kind of one kind of master kind of finding that I'd like to kind of dwell on for a second, and that is that sustainability and Industry 4.0 are inextricably intertwined with participants' expectations of how the creative industries in the UK are going to develop over the next 10 years. We can't pull them apart. And next slide, please. I think, you know, it is entirely possible that sustainability in Industry 4.0 could be addressed by policymakers on an individual basis, but there are powerful synergies to be gained. And on this slide, you can see from our interviews and workshops how we expect the focus on sustainability to change in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see that we're moving really to a greater focus on climate change, access to water, biodiversity, etc., away from really a low carbon economy agenda, which is the one that seems to dominate much of the industry at the moment. And this change is going to be accelerated by the convergence and embedding of multiple Industry 4.0 technologies, which will bring the digital, virtual, and physical worlds together. Next slide, please. We ran 2 workshops, and in both workshops, participants were asked to identify the drivers of change and the likely scenarios. We asked them to do this after we had presented global UK sustainability, Industry 4.0 and creative industry specific trends to them. So on this particular slide, you can see the key trends or drivers that were highlighted by the participants for the 2 areas, sustainability and Industry 4.0. And I'll let you read these for yourselves. But what I would say is that if you look between the 2 columns, you can see there's a connection between automation on the one side and then what's referred to as digital on the other side. We have innovative design on the one side, and then we have sustainable design. And I think this is really just, again, emphasizing the connections and synergies between these 2 agendas coming together over the next decade. Next slide, please. So Martin and I really kind of very energized by this particular recurring theme in the workshops. And this theme is fragmentation. Martin, could you just put the next slide on for me, please? We estimate by 2030, there will be over 350,000 micro businesses and small and medium-sized enterprises in the UK creative industries. And more than 95% of those are going to employ fewer than 10 people. And I think from a policymaker point of view, this is very problematic, because how do you connect to such small businesses in such great quantities? Now, each of the verticals is going to be impacted by sustainability and Industry 4.0, but the entrepreneurial and independent creatives in the workshops had little or no involvement in policy making, and insufficient scale to engage in a focused round of centrally driven discussion. So this is not ideal. And the risk is that independent artists, creatives, and entrepreneurs who need to quickly engage with sustainability and Industry 4.0 may not get the support they need. And this applies to more generic issues, such as export advice too. And in fact, Martin will talk a little bit later on about how they have been left behind in the grants and loan schemes that have been put in during lockdown in the UK. Another characteristic of fragmentation is that you've got multiple trade federations and related bodies, and they're all seeking to represent specific interest groups or the industry as a whole, but their membership typically appears to be more representative of the medium-sized and larger creative businesses or the arts and cultural institutions. And our participants in the workshops suggested that a radically different approach is really needed for the creative industries, one that really reflects this fragmentation. Next slide, please. You probably can't read this terribly well, but I think you can get an idea of the pattern on the screen. So this is a heat map of sustainability initiatives, and it shows there's a lot of activity, but there's also much duplication, many overlaps, and many gaps. So the color coding here indicates the extent to which there are initiatives. So grey means there isn't very much. Orange means actually there's quite a lot of activity on sustainability in that particular vertical. And I think you can see that, you know, some of these silos are way ahead of the others, and they do not seem to share information across these boundaries. I'll show you the picture for Industry 4.0 as well. Next slide, please. So slightly different color coding, but I think you get the idea. The cooler colors like the grays and the blues represent lower amounts of activity, and the red means a lot of activity. The horizontal axis is slightly different this time. Rather than the Sustainable Development Goals from the previous slide, 0.0 technologies, and then across the top we have the different subsectors. Again, you can see there are certain technologies which are leaping ahead, and then there are certain sectors that are leaping ahead. But again, there's very little pooling of knowledge between any of these different silos. Next slide, please. So boundaries are an issue. The boundaries tend to be porous. They tend to overlap. We also have some players that we don't traditionally associate with the sector, the FANGs, so Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Alphabet. These are major disruptors in the creative industries, and they have been for about 10 years. And this is further blurring the boundaries in the process. And Createch is particularly problematic in our view. So Createch companies and jobs in particular just simply don't fit into well-established taxonomies used to generate UK government figures on things like employment and GBA. And this is particularly important to resolve, as I mentioned earlier, they're a key growth engine. The Creative Industries Council have done a pretty good job of capturing some of the challenges with Createch by dividing this subsector into segments such as immersive entertainment, so new ways of telling stories and presenting content using technology and personalized tools, using technology to automate processes. However, it's likely that this does not fully capture the full range of companies involved. Moving on to the next bullet, measurement and baseline challenges. This is a recurring theme, not just for Createch. Measurement of the sector, the boundaries, employment levels, GVA, exports, cultural value, comparisons with other sectors and countries, measurement of the creativity of a location, a city or a region. All of these seem to be up for grabs at the moment. And related to measurement, there is no agreed UK or international baseline for sustainability in the industry 4.0 in the creative industries. So how are we going to measure whether policy changes are effective? And moving down the bullets, the experts in the workshops and interviews are anticipating significant skill gaps in the sector by 2030. And these could undermine the sector in its ability to deliver on GVA, employment and export expectations. This includes, interestingly, some core skills in areas such as leadership, finance and technology. So it's not all about sustainability in Industry 4.0. These are very basic things that the sector seems to be lacking. And it's probably made worse by the fact that it's full of very small businesses. There's also a suggestion that a comprehensive review is required of the skill needs for the creative industries to allow for a realignment of education research to deliver what is truly needed by 2030. Again, continuing down the bullets, there was repeated reference to the need to improve the fit between what the sector needs from tertiary and executive education over the next decade and what is actually on offer today. For participants, it wasn't just about content of courses, it was also about formats. So the example that was discussed quite openly was about executive education and training. Small creative businesses tend to be deadline driven, meaning there's little time or inclination to acquire new skills and knowledge unless you can directly apply it. This suggests bite-sized content exploiting virtual classrooms as much as possible. Ironically, the COVID-19 pandemic may provide much of the impetus to developing that sort of content so that it can be delivered effectively to the sector. But it took that it has taken the pandemic really to accelerate this. And I think for us, a surprising finding was that the investment community in the UK and internationally should become a priority for providers of executive education to that sector, as the creative industry sector is poorly understood from a business perspective. And yet injection of capital is clearly going to be crucial to the success of many sustainability and Industry 4 initiatives. On the next bullet, our participants questioned whether the UK government had an adequate long-range vision for the creative industries. Would we be able to grow businesses that could match the FANGs in scale and reach was a question that was debated openly. An export-led growth would be much more certain if there were a long-term strategy to build larger British creative companies that can punch their weight in the market against the international competition. So this means going well beyond the sector deal in the UK. And if you're joining us internationally, you may not know what this is, but this was something set up in about 2018 to try and put more of a focus on grants and infrastructure and capability building for the sector in the UK. And it's actually in the process of being updated at the moment. Again, it's something else that COVID has interfered with. And then on this final bullet, our experts in the workshops felt it was time to review all of the taxonomies used to measure the sector, as they may reveal the full extent of the sector's contribution to the UK economy. So it's already known to be a big contributor, but the feeling was that it's actually even bigger. And there was also the question of whether to include jobs or roles in other sectors that people in those sectors consider to be creative. So software coding, engineers, scientists, etc. There doesn't seem to be a common approach internationally on this either. A different example of underestimation is design and creative arts versus STEM education. Createch specifically relies on the synergy between creative or art subjects and science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So there's a strong argument for investment in STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, rather than STEM. And this seems to be rather contentious when discussed among policymakers at the moment. Next slide, please. As Martin and I worked through what the outputs had given us, we realized there were two umbrella 2030 scenarios that seem to tie the findings together. And you can read a lot more about these in the report, but I'll just kind of précis them here. So the first one was invest to sustain. This is a supply side scenario, and it involves extensive use of intelligent and automated equipment to integrate all digital and physical elements from inspiration to the end experience or point of consumption. And I'm going to contrast this with a demand side scenario called New Ways to Grow. And this involves sustainable innovations based on Industry 4.0 technologies, primarily to grow audiences and consumption. This could be achieved in numerous ways: digital storytelling to expand the market for an existing physical experience, lots of that going on at the moment in lockdown, creating secondary markets and platforms for product reuse and repair, reaching more consumers with digital subscription commerce models for content with inbuilt carbon offsetting, etc., etc. There's a lot of different options there. And I think if you look across the sector in the UK, you can see incomplete aspects of both scenarios in operation today. And then came pandemic. Next slide, please. So here is the thing that's been causing us all this trouble. We completed our work literally just before lockdown, and we've had an opportunity over the last couple of months to go back over our findings and kind of speculate on, what would really change. And I want to kind of share a little bit of that thinking with you now. So next slide, please. So on the left, you can see some of the distressing headlines that lie behind the recent £1.5 billion injection of loans and government grants to save the UK arts and cultural heritage. This is literally within the last couple of days. And yet, while many have suffered, there are subsectors such as games and animation that actually have surged. And there have actually been some sound attempts at innovative ways to both create and to distribute content. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see two columns of examples that caught our attention. If anybody on the call was at CogX, the recent virtual conference, and attended some of the Createch sessions, you will have seen some of these in action. But basically, it's not a totally bad news story. Next slide. And now there's a lot of people who are asking very seriously what the sector is going to look like in the future. So I think we're going to live for a couple of years with what I like to think of as the new abnormal before we get to the new normal, whatever that is. And in this interim period, it's highly likely we're going to see continuing business failures and low audience figures. And this is why government money is urgently needed all around the world. I think this also goes back to Martin's comment at the beginning, which is, I think what this has revealed is the creative sector actually hasn't really been that innovative, because if they had, then they would have had more of these kind of backup plans in place, ready to go when we hit this lockdown. It's not like a pandemic was not predicted by many people over many decades. It's becoming clearer that high density fixed venues such as theatres, stadiums, are going to struggle to reopen until infections are much lower or a vaccine is found. And so a knock-on effect of this is that big live and film productions are slipping into 2021 or 2022. And so that's creating a bit of an opportunity for the independents. Another reason why I think the sector might actually kind of recover quicker through the actions of some of the smaller businesses. We can already see the kind of guidance that applies to parts of the sector, such as filmmaking, and today I was looking at one for dance. And I've put the word clunky here, but that's really an understatement. These guidelines have a profound impact on cost, productivity, and in some cases morale, but they're really needed. And so the sector does have to find ways of dealing with them. And while it's tempting to keep listing negatives, as I said earlier, we do see positive signs in terms of consumers and audiences being prepared to pay for virtual consumption. And this is something which has always been problematic. Even if the ticket price is low, the international audiences can be sizable. So in the UK, for instance, the National Theatre at Home streams. This includes things like Andrea Levy's play, Small Island, some Shakespeare, etc. These streams have got to 12 million people around the world so far. And where only live experience will do, there are companies planning a return to open air and drive-in experiences with a modern twist, which is not something we've really had much in the UK. And then finally, as we've been scanning social media and newspaper headlines, we can see that there is this desire to build back better. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what does that really mean? And I think in practical terms for this sector, it really means a greater emphasis on sustainability, and fashion, I think, is right that we're going to be at the forefront of that, and a desire to make Industry 4.0 technologies deliver on their promise, which brings me to Createch. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that some parts of the sector have benefited from the pandemic in much the same way that companies like Zoom have. Certainly, as remote working has increased, you can see that those that provide tools for collaboration and process automation are gaining revenues and market capitalization. So an example of that in the creative industries might be Improbable. This is a company that made tools for collaborative game design. We also have platform businesses in the direct-to-consumer space, such as My Wardrobe HQ, which rents fashion effectively, and they're also doing very well. I would go as far as to say that I think the pandemic has pushed that market forward by 5 years in the UK. If I look at the kind of business-to-business space, then the streaming and app-based businesses in the music and video world have boomed. People are settling into their sofas for a couple of months in some cases. But seriously, business such as Smartify, which is shown here on the right, which provides for virtual tours of exhibitions and museums in the B2B space, have also been providing a lifeline for theatres, galleries, museums, and independent cinema. And the pandemic has also been a catalyst for innovation in consumer-facing Createch. So if you were at the recent CogX virtual conference, you will have heard how the pandemic forced fictioneers to rethink the upcoming Wallace and Gromit exhibition, which is called The Big Fix-It. This was originally going to be a site-specific exhibition, and it's now an immersive augmented reality experience, which you can indulge at home. So next slide, please. So I'll pause after this one. So is it Createch to the rescue? Possibly in some areas. And if I put definitions to one side and just reflect more generally on what we heard at CogX and from our own research, it seems to me that we are still really at the beginning of the Createch journey. It seems likely that for the next few years, it's mostly the back office of the creative industries that will benefit from Createch. There's little doubt that the pandemic has accelerated adoption of new ways of working, and it's accelerated acceptance that automation of processes is the way to go. It's interesting to me that Createch is not being driven forward by the industry giants. It's networks of small and medium-sized businesses that are really the innovators. Yes, there is a need to share knowledge on how to use the technologies amongst these networks. But what we're also finding is it's the organizational learning that needs to be disseminated. So how do you organize yourself to do this? What does governance look like? What skills do you need? What capabilities do you need? And this is proving difficult given the fragmentation of the sector. I would say the business to business space has got more structure to it in Createch than the consumer space at the moment. I would go as far as to say that we don't really know which consumer applications are going to be the game changers. And if you look at diffusion of technology more generally in the world, then you're probably 10 years away from a dominant design in this particular area. And part of the problem with the consumer space is that the business models aren't really in place yet. And there doesn't seem to be any disciplined approach to developing them. And this also has an impact on the willingness of investors to put their money into the sector. So there's a bit of a vicious circle here. So where you can see some interesting business models and approaches is in the heritage sector, particularly in augmented live experiences. Again, there were some great examples at CogX. The fragmentation and siloed nature of the sector, however, does mean that even these learnings, which are being celebrated often in the press, are simply not being transferred effectively into other parts of the sector. As with any high technology venture, research and development is essential. Given where we are in the life cycle of Createch, we probably need 10 to 15-year roadmaps, and we need funding to match that. Given the number of unknowns in areas such as audiences of the future and immersive technologies, we need primary research, not just technology transfer into the sector and development. And I do wonder if the UK government is fully cognizant of that need. And despite all of this, it is absolutely clear that the UK is in a very good leadership position when it comes to Createch. So many problems to be solved, but a good starting point. So I'm conscious that there's a lot to process there. So I think it's time to pause and have a little Q&A, and then I'll hand back to Martin for the conclusions from the report.
So do we have any questions or observations? At this stage, it seems a bit of a stunned silence because of all that information. And I'm wondering if nothing pops up, we might progress, and that'll give you a bit more time to think through some questions at the end. I think
I'm happy to say a few words. It's Nick from DCMS.
Sure. I mean, I was looking at trying to run it through the chat box, but given the paucity of questions at the moment, please go ahead.
Some really interesting points that you've made, just from kind of government's point of view and speaking strictly off the record. I think, government isn't necessarily good at having a long-term strategy on say the creative industries beyond a couple of years, say the sector deal, for example. And I agree with you that the government in general needs to start thinking much more longer term about what it needs to put in place over the next, say, 5 to 10 years. I think the key problem is, how do we do that? And just very briefly on the last point on that slide, long-term R&D, I think government does recognise that, and particularly prompted by industry and people like the Creative Industries Council, where we had a meeting yesterday, and this same point was made very, very strongly. And all I can say on that is watch this space, that there are some potential interventions there that we're working on that hopefully may address this.
Oh, that's very good to hear, Nick. I mean, again, I think, I'm sure there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than we can see from our kind of public research. I think what really does strike me with this point about R&D is the length of these timelines. I think at the start of our interviews and workshop, I would have been tempted to say long term in 5 years, but having gone through all of the work that Martin and I have done, you know, I think it is quite a bit longer than that we're looking at in some of these areas. But it's very good to hear that that's in very active discussion.
So I think Nick's intervention has heated up some people. So I have a couple of questions coming in. So there's one from John, and it's along the lines of, if the three drivers of creative sector development are sustainability, 4.0 and economics, the new normal, not quite sure we're saying those are the drivers, but Trevor will, I'm sure, will pick this up. To what extent are these driving the same versus opposite directions? I wonder, for instance, if automation versus the overwhelming new sort of normal needs to create green and creative jobs for young adults into the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are kind of at the macro level. I would say yes, those are kind of drivers of a sort, but I think the real drivers are kind of hidden underneath that, which you'll see, you know, we've detailed in the report. And I think there is a risk that some of these will pull in different directions. But we didn't really pick much evidence of that up. I mean, a lot of the applications for Industry 4.0 technology was really to make the sustainability agenda work better. So that's kind of fairly consistent all the way through our research. And then in terms of impacts on employment, we are not picking up strong signals that the kind of automation that will take place in this sector will drive employment levels down. You know, it's more about improving productivity levels so that people can take more creative activity to the market. Now, whether, you know, that will land differently in terms of different age bands, I can't be too sure, but I think what it does suggest is that universities need to be ready to, you know, to get the right skills into people coming into their system for all of these technologies, and not get bogged down in the more kind of traditional tracks for design and the arts that we have at the moment. And this probably means that we need different ways of providing access to technology for educational institutions so that young people coming in are seeing the latest, greatest stuff and they're not stuck with 5-year-old technology. Martin, this is probably more your field, so I'll shut up and let you talk about education a bit more.
I thought maybe I'll bring that into the closing, concluding comments, but there's just a couple of questions that have come in a sense, one around if we're going to see more integration of the technology, doesn't that mean we're going to see more CO2? Is question number one. And question number two, to close this round of questions, is are there any indications that createch sectors are more evolved in other countries?
So as you can imagine, when you look at, I'll take the second one first, actually. When you look at North America, you definitely see a lot of createch activity. When you look at the Nordics, there are certain countries where you can see, like Sweden, you can see quite a bit of createch type activity there. I think what strikes me about the UK is that we seem to have the broadest createch sector, and we also seem to have, in each of the subsectors within createch, we do seem to have many of the world leaders, which is tremendous. What we don't have are big companies. We don't have what the investment community like to think of as unicorns, and that's a UK kind of problem generally. I think in terms of kind of integration, yes. I mean, you know, I think it's you know, the people who will probably benefit behind the scenes in createch are the people who do system integration work, architecture, all of those disciplines that bring all the different pieces together, but also the educational establishments that can actually bring an integrated agenda together for people. so that, you know, you don't go to just learn about robotics in filmmaking. You go to learn about, you know, new kinds of filmmaking that would cover immersive kind of storytelling, AR, robotic cameras, you know, kind of advances in machine learning for
Hello? Hello? Hello, can you hear us? Or is Trevor dropped out? Or can anybody indicate whether you can hear me? So I think maybe what we'll do, I'm sure Trevor will rejoin, but I think what I will do is I'll move on. So yes, that is what I'll do. Okay, so yes, okay, sorry, that's just thrown me for a second. I'm sure Trevor is ingenious enough to rejoin us in a short while. What I'm going to do is really just probably reinforce a number of the points that Trevor's made. So certainly,
hello.
You're
Trevor,
back.
Trevor,
Okay, so I think I've just decided.
I'm back and I'll shut up.
I've just, yeah, I assumed you had the brain power to get back in, so I just moved on. So and you haven't missed much. So essentially, there's about 15 or so key conclusions, and this you'll find this really underlines and reinforces many of the points that Trevor made. So creative industries, within lockdown or coming out of lockdown. So clearly, the whole process of the pandemic has really illustrated the value of creative industries to society, particularly if we hadn't had our creative industries, whether it's films or live streaming of theatre performances or people starting to react creatively using video conferencing to do dance courses or whatever, we would be in a real state. So it's illustrated the societal and economic value of the sector to societies. However, the UK government has been pretty slow to move on its support packages, and as Trevor, highlighted, this seems to be more focused around the cultural industries and perhaps towards the larger institutional side. So we've still got this challenge of how you support the mass of those 10-person companies in the sector. So what it's also illustrated or provided is this tremendous melting pot for new ideas and thinking, where particularly people are experimenting with lots of novel applications for video conferencing technologies, huge spurts to the developments of things like TikTok and other, technologies. But also I think people getting interested in other forms of collaborative software, for example. So there are lots of ideas that have actually started in the petri dish, but how many of those ideas have been monetized to date? So this goes back to the creative and the innovative. There are some examples that we've come across, so the, on a small scale level, online busking, where people are using PayPal, for example, to have an online tip jar. So it's sort of, and we've come across examples of people who have started to make quite a decent living, on relatively low value donations, but quite high value online audiences. So yeah, a lot of ideas, but perhaps if we're thinking proactively, a number of organizations may have used this time almost to do R&D. And so some of the thinking may emerge in products and services, as we move further down the line. It's also accelerated the fact that we can do more with the current technology than we thought. So as an example of a film actually being remotely completed. And again, maybe some of those, in a sense, tech that was in the lab have been moved forward, you know, for people to actually try and use them more effectively. So, you know, within the creative industries in vertical areas, you know, things have perhaps, you know, got a jump start. And examples like the completion of the films obviously has a potential sustainability benefit by people not having to travel. So some of this will lead to other broader questions, perhaps. And going on to that, you know, particularly in the UK, you know, with the driver for 2050 that is still there in terms of net zero carbon being, you know, quite a key priority for government. You know, what we are starting to see is Greta Thunberg starting to get more active, and as perhaps, you know, things slow, we may start to see the climate change discussion emerge, you know, again and stronger, and the need for sort of global solutions to the challenge. Interestingly, I picked up today that in the UK, in Extinction Rebellion, who ostensibly started to look at the climate change issue, are actually now starting on an action to do with fast fashion that's been, you know, exacerbated by the low-cost labour issues in Leicester in the UK. So maybe some of these NGOs might morph their approaches. But, you know, as Trevor highlighted, there's going to be other agenda items as we move towards 2030. And in the UK, circular economy, resource efficiency is going to become increasingly important. Also issues around biodiversity and access to water. So another way to think about this positively, could we drive this, use this as a way to actually accelerate things? So what does a low carbon circular creative industry, you know, play that with different vertical sectors? What does a low carbon circular fashion industry look like for 2030, and what are some of the opportunities for the UK? Coupled to this, what we've also picked up, and it's sort of not necessarily directly creative industries, but it does overlap. And this illustrates some of the challenges that we've identified with the edges of the sector, is this whole growth in a new movement of makers, modifiers and fixers. People who are, you know, they have the tools, they have, you know, at least historically before the lockdown, the places and spaces to meet, but they have the networks, that's important, to start to make, modify and fix products. And you've started to see some elements of this, you know, come into practice with groups starting to make masks and 3D print ventilators. So this whole grassroots decentralized approach. And I think, you know, part of some of the discussion is we may start to see, you know, more community orientated, you know, activities, you know, that in a sense have been empowered by the lockdown. And I think, you know, one of the other, you know, actually questions we may see that was almost a given was, you know, on a megatrend level, you know, this whole issue of 3 megatrends broadly encapsulated into by Thomas L. Friedman in Thank You for Being Late, you know, technological acceleration, tackling the environmental problem and globalization. Maybe the pandemic will actually lead to much more regional blocks, more nationalism and actually community, you know, development. So, you know, what does this mean? So, for example, you know, I'll just move back very quickly as an example, very practical example. I also chair a so-called repair cafe in the UK, and the pandemic has led us to to drive and innovate to produce a Facebook-driven, advice, an online chat forum. Because we can't physically meet to help the community fix products, it's driven us to develop an online model. We wouldn't have done that unless the pandemic was there. So some organizations are forced to innovate in that sense and come up with new approaches. Job security, well, again, this has illustrated some of the sort of fundamental challenges the sector faces in the sense of the layers of the onion of the sector, significant temporary gig economy and freelance layers within the sector, many of which were very fast to be removed. Now, to what extent, some people, it means that some people have been lost to the sector. To what extent the support structures will get back to support these people is going to be a huge challenge. But it's really illustrated some of the job insecurity around the edges of the sector. And as Trevor highlighted very clearly, we've seen very much this issue of the fragmentation. The 11 or so different sectors, with different sort of needs, capacities. But this again has also been illustrated in terms of the Industry 4.0 and sustainability side, again, within those sectors, very fragmented approaches and different issues. So, for example, music events would have issues related to the environmental or broader sustainability impacts, would relate to, in terms of physical musical events, to travel, plastic bottles, waste, etc. Whereas there are different issues in terms of broadcast, gaming, etc., more to do with energy consumption. And within architecture, product design, fashion design, it is perhaps more material. So there are different issues and different priorities in the sector. And that also is true within the different Industry 4.0 technologies. So very much we had this clear call for a long view for the sector. Obviously this came out when we did the study before lockdown hit, but in a sense, one can argue there's a need, obviously, for immediate, short, medium, and long-term view. Yes, one is the bailout, in a sense, is trying to tackle some of the immediate-term challenges, but that doesn't obviate having a clearer, long-term roadmap for the sector and the subsectors. So this, is key, and really, there's a feeling that we've had that really a lot of the focus has been on the big players and the big institutions across the creative and cultural sectors, and a lot of those small companies and those the individual employees, have been in many ways neglected. But this is the heart of the sector. So. And there's very little data in terms of creative startups again. So there needs to be a strategic view taken to the sector. And again, as Trevor's highlighted very well and very clearly, perhaps the sector has not been valued. That cultural value, in the sense of, providing, support to people in lockdown, laughing, amusing comedies and, crying at, musicals and, etc. Then, it's that other je ne sais quoi of the sector. But also in terms of the economic value of the sector, as perceived by government and investors, there's been, perhaps a feeling that, as came out in another webinar I did with European players and in Canada, that sometimes, it's seen as a sector that's manned by creatives who really are not business people. But again, as illustrated, particularly in the report, there is a number of very successful companies. So there's this sort of misperception, and that's perhaps in the bailout package from our initial findings, that maybe there's this emphasis on the cultural value. You know, maybe people will visit opera and and value that at a high level of government, but they're not going to step, inside a games company that is, trying to drive forward new innovations. So they sort of get the cultural element, but not maybe the business element, and there's some work to be done on that. Sorry, just moving in the right direction now. So clearly, with increasing segments of the sector being able to operate, globally, particularly where one can access global markets online, we're seeing this growing competition, from the FANGs, as Trevor mentioned, but also other industry players like Sony and Disney, and new players. So Netflix in film and TV, Facebook in advertising, Microsoft in gaming, and companies like Amazon who are playing in various areas, but also have significant investment in R&D. So there's a challenge here also for our innovative startups about, how do we protect and nurture, and maybe, players come in to buy out new technologies, and the fact that we may lose some of our, innovative leadership in certain areas unless we address it as a key issue, because there are going to be other predators looking to move into the area. And again, in that sense, we're not even talking about Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, etc. And Zoom, for example, with all the investment, they're receiving, is partially or majority owned by Chinese. Again, TikTok by Chinese. So, what are the Chinese players going to do, perhaps when they move significantly more out of China? Measurement, as was discussed before, so do we need better metrics to measure the value of the sector? Are we undervaluing and underestimating the size of the sector? For example, again, lockdown experience, my daughter's boyfriend stays for here. He's a physicist from Imperial College by training, but he's working in The Guardian around website, and metrics and analytics, etc., etc. So those coders and engineers that are operating in the sector and the tech elements of the different 11 verticals are probably not included as being employees within the sector. So as we see, that technology, not just in direct applications, such as robot cameras used on the BBC, but as we see technology integrated into the sector more en masse, how are we going to measure this? And indeed, we need to set the right baselines on this. For example, in Industry 4.0 and a series of enabling technologies and, sustainability across the SDGs, we really don't have a baseline about where the verticals sit. We don't have a baseline, about where the verticals sit in the UK, let alone globally. So we need to get, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, the good old mantra. So key is we have to build the skills and capacity. And so came out very strongly and is this need that, of course, it's the creative industry. So many players that set up the businesses in the sector are often from creative disciplines, and they're not trained in business. So there's a huge gap to provide business skills to those who have a creative, training or bent as such. And particularly, we perceive, big opportunities for these smaller bite-sized courses for the industry, for those small companies that don't really have enough time to get away, for a week or whatever, executive MBA type of things, to more blended learning approaches that adjust to the jobs, to real life jobs, providing basic finance skills, providing marketing, raising funding. And of course, I would say we are interested in this because we're from the first business school for the creative industries. And we're very interested to have any discussions around this issue if there are others that want to take up this discussion. And just moving towards the end of the presentation, the last couple, we need to create the right sort of environment where creativity will flourish, and then create the right processes to move good ideas to the market. And so we may borrow from regional development approaches such as innovation districts to create creative districts. And we've seen, I think, places like Leeds have developed this, more focused on art side rather than the SME side. So perhaps the KTNs, etc. As the UK is sort of leveling out and regionalising, we need to look at these clusters, these labs, these districts, etc. And indeed, I think I just picked up that Penzance has just got some funding to set up some sort of new zone. What we also got very clearly is that often companies within the subsectors get buried in their subsectors, and they would really like to know best practice from what's going on in other subsectors. Particularly that came out on the sustainability side, and that very much chimes with the idea that often innovation comes from outside your immediate sector or subsector. So key thing, again, as Trevor illustrated, was a lot of the, with Brexit, looming its ugly head again, at least from my point of view, a very ugly head from my point of view, is a lot of the support you seem to be coming out from government at the moment is generic support for exporters and SMEs. So your exporter of chickens is very different from your exporter of fashion. So we need a bespoke sets of package, often more targeted to the needs of the subsectors and the creative industries. And again, that often may need to be more perhaps webinar based, more one-to-one mentoring, which sadly is not the direction that a lot of the business support has gone with in the UK. And if we believe, as Trevor illustrated, there's going to be continued growing interest in and innovation in the creative sector, well, maybe we need a roadmap for the creative sector going into the future as to how UK can be a winner in that. And I know there are, CIC have some interest in taking that area forward. But again, in terms of how we bring everybody with this agenda going forward, we need better mechanisms for dialogue. We got very clearly within the Foresight workshops that a lot of the micro SMEs are not engaged in the debate. They don't know how to engage in the debate. So again, there are some concerns with the grant monies coming on board, whether it's from the package that was announced, 1.5 billion for the sector, or for example, in the Sustainable Innovation Fund, if people are looking at low carbon creative technologies, how many of those SMEs and micro SMEs are going to be engaged with that? Do they know what they need to do? Who do they contact, et cetera, et cetera. So just in closing, in the policy side, we've seen earlier and more significant support in other countries. We've been sadly again rather late in terms of our support. It's great that it's here, but already you've seen some theatres go to the wall, and there are probably a whole raft of other businesses, that have gone to the wall. Yet the economic value may be more significant than some sectors that have got early stage support. So I think for time, I'm not going to read through the different policy initiatives, but certainly there are perhaps wider policy initiatives that can be taken in the straight grant approach, looking at how one supports both the demand side and the supply side, particularly, capacity building, skills building, et cetera, et cetera. So, and what we found again is that there are a whole range of policymakers engaged in the creative industries and different stakeholders from outside, But again, it's what perhaps is not happening is perhaps, you know, within some elements of in the research and innovation side, perhaps some elements maybe go into maybe more the social science, the arts and humanities, you know, side, and don't necessarily touch the hard technology side. You know, that was illustrated by something I'm reviewing at the moment, which really illustrated the significant challenges around technology metals and critical raw materials that, of course, are really important in any digital economies, and also are really important in the sense of low carbon technologies. And, you know, therefore, we'll touch on this sector. But, you know, do we have any initiatives focusing on this area? So I think there's some work to be done in government to join up all the different players. So what's next? I mean, we're myself and Trevor and UCA and the business school is very open to looking at new initiatives. We feel there is perhaps a need for some form of new forum to bring out some of these discussions. And before Q&A, I'll just mention something that may be of interest. So as much as anything, so I don't forget to say it, is particularly in the fashion sector, where we will be hosting in March next year an online conference looking at sustainability, fashion, etc., as a global sector. And we've bitten the bullet ourselves to move this online, and we'll be looking at a new format, building on our 22 previous conferences that we've organized. So I don't know if there are any questions that have emerged or thoughts that emerged, Trevor, that both myself and yourself can give some observations on.
It's very peaceful in the chat at the moment, but that may be because I got disconnected for a time. I suggest if there's anybody that would like to ask a question directly, they come off mute and ask away.
Sure. So was anything that particularly stood out there? You know, as I say, if we use the precedent of before, by all means, anybody jump on with a comment. Do you think we've missed out anything? You know, what do you consider might be the key issues? Very interested to hear from you guys. We've got people from India, the Nordic region.
Dita has just left, actually. We do have a comment in from Shalini saying they would love to collaborate for institutional collaboration from India.
Great. You know, that can I change that around and actually say what sort of initiatives are going on within India on the creative industries? I think you'd highlighted at the end before when Trevor dropped off that there was some emerging initiatives around Createch. Is that using some of the Indian expertise in programming and maybe other forms of technology? So could you unmute yourself and just say one or two things about what you see Createch, how Createch is developing in India, because that's not something we're aware of. Maybe you want to say silent. So, right, well, I think for everybody's time, if there aren't any questions, oh, yeah, very exciting, creative, and taking place in our institution in fashion, artificial intelligence, and ML, machine learning.
Machine learning. Hi, this is Chalini here. Just wanted to second what Costa was saying. Both of us are actually heading an initiative in our institute, which is actually looking at how we could cull out, employ AI and machine learning into the whole aspect of analyzing trends, and that also fashion trends for our country. So there are initiatives which are taking place, and people are looking to truly understand technology, but from the creative side. And so there is this intermix of designers being taught or programmed to understand the other side, and kind of apply their skill sets to a larger area.
Yes, I mean, I make a quick comment, and I'm sure you'll have some comments as well, Trevor. Certainly, that is within our business school for the creative industries. One of our strengths is around the business side of the fashion industry, as well as us having a separate school in fashion. And certainly, you've seen a number of them. You know, the program leaders and lecturers, you know, getting a lot more interested in, you know, the different tools, the new tools that one can use for trend analysis, forecasting, foresighting. So that I'm seeing that, you know, coming into even mainstream usage. And I guess there's an issue there of the future of those who are in the sector being trained in those new techniques. I can remember when I was many thousand years ago, when I was analyzing trends and initiatives for one of the world's biggest trade exhibition companies, I had to go to desk research. I have to visit the library to read Mintel reports. I had to, you know, go very crude, you know, access to the internet. But, you know, that's 1,000 years ago. The world has moved on. But, you know, it may be in need for training in these new tools in the courses. I mean, what your thoughts are, Trevor?
Well, I was really going to really just make mention of some work that IBM did really from about 2015, 2016 onwards in India with Bollywood kind of fashion designers, for instance, like Falguni, Shane Peacock, to look at trends in kind of fashion and also in terms of their own creative practice. So I think there is quite a lot of kind of case studies and examples that you may already be aware of or may not, but I'd have a look at particularly the work that IBM had been doing in India around that. And the IBM Research India lab also had got some quite gifted people when it came to doing this kind of work. And there's some very good work as well with Jason Gretsch over in Australia that's probably worth looking at. Much of that, the background work on that was done in India as well. I think for me it's partly mastering these machine learning and artificial intelligence skills, but it's also about learning how to collaborate with designers and these tools. You know, this is not necessarily the natural tool set for a designer, particularly in fashion. And what you don't want to do is convert them into some kind of computer programmer. So working out, you know, the processes and organizationally how teams operate and where it fits into their creative processes is as kind of an interesting area for research for me as the technology itself.
I mean, I think there is, however, you know, another issue there in terms of stuff I've been doing, you know, in parallel and outside of this about, you know, as we see more technology embedded and software embedded into all sorts of products, and we see, you know, kids being taught about coding, there are some issues there about how this is going to move forward, you know, and, you know, do product designers in its broadest sense, different job titles in different sectors, actually need to have at least some basic idea there, but also, you know, others that may have been trained in design or design management, maybe they find jobs in more, you know, futures orientated research, trend analysis, etc., using, you know, the machine learning tools. So I think there's something there in, you know, perhaps into the future as well. So I think there's another question here from Mark around clusters and hubs. I mean, having looked at a lot of stuff over the years around clusters and hubs, more linked to the sustainability side of it. What you've seen in some parts is actually startups around, inverted commas, sustainability orientated businesses being set up alongside creative businesses. There's one I cannot remember the name of, but it's a converted tobacco factory in one of the regions of Italy. So, there are, and I think, Trevor, you found quite an interesting example of a report that was analysing some of these hubs.
Yeah, I mean, there are several, kind of reports going back over the last few years looking at the effectiveness of these different hubs. I think the one that you're referring to is either was the Knowledge Transfer Network or Creative England. I have to kind of go back to the database and have a look at it, but it did a very, very good job of looking at 40 or 50 of these hubs up and down the country. And really drew out, I think, 5 or 6 key learnings from across all of them. And some of those learnings are actually, I think, difficult just at the moment, because I think one of the really important learnings is that physical co-location and physical collaboration is really important, particularly when you're trying to get something started. And in a world where physical meetings are difficult, then it's a bit problematic.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we have in the UK is, speaking very crudely and generically, when the Conservatives came into power under Cameron, effectively they abolished the regions. They abolished the regional development agencies, which would be the natural places where some of these hubs and more regional or town city-based clusters would develop. In the UK, but you've seen obviously very different approaches throughout Europe, where there's more of a weddedness to regionalisation, to so-called smart specialisation. But we've almost got a sort of strange, I'm not quite, netherworld, I don't even know how to explain it, where, that regionalisation seems to be coming in, a bit under the cover, with under this government, with new hubs and centres being more, distributed throughout the UK. But the sort of term regional policy doesn't seem to be on the table. It's more around, I can't remember how we characterised it, Trevor, more about the levelling out of the UK.
Yeah, levelling up, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think all of these things help with the kind of diffusion of capability across the country, and diffusion across the country also helps with, building up, kind of revenues domestically, but also contributes to, innovation, exports, etc., etc. And I think, I know levelling up is very much a kind of a current ruling party term, but the principle of levelling up has been known for a very, very long time in other areas. And, if you look at, advanced manufacturing, for instance, and the way that the UK kind of improved global competitiveness in that area, then a lot of that was done by exploiting pockets of capability in parts of the country that aren't London. And that's what a lot of levelling up is about. It's about clusters and hubs away from the southeast of England, and tapping into the talent pool of the country as a whole.
And I wonder, building on the COVID-19, ripple effect, is maybe we're going to see groups of people who've got used to working from home product, in a very productive way, maybe, starting to say, maybe that's the way I want to work now, and I want to spend more time in my community. I don't want to travel, commute so much. And maybe you're going to see also people starting to, spin off and set up their own, operations. And therefore, there's another driver potentially to see more of those local regional clusters and centres develop. And I suppose coupled to that is unfortunately, again, in the UK and other countries, we are going to see layoffs and redundancies as the furlough schemes, you know, decline and collapse. And maybe we, you know, as part of that, we may see another, you know, impetus for entrepreneurial activity, and maybe some new lifeblood moves back into the sector from outside, you know, question mark. So do we have any final comments or questions, you know, through the chat box or physically?
Let's just have a look. Physical issue. So again, Mark has kind of built on this kind of physical location point and saying, well, you know, there's, you know, is this a good moment in time to see if the idea of the physical hub could really be fleshed out and made to work so much better in the virtual world? And I think the answer to that question is most definitely. I think, you know, I think the challenge with a lot of these kind of virtual technologies is that they're not actually addressing the pain point that physical meetings address so eloquently, which is building up trust between very diverse groups of people. And that's really a trick we haven't learned yet. So if anybody's got any good ideas on that, I'd be very interested to hear. And then there was a final comment on freelancers and sharing knowledge will be hugely important for the next couple of years. Definitely.
So I think we're at sort of 1.5 hours. So, you know, thank you everybody who's remained on the call, and thanks both from Trevor and I for the excellent questions and observations. And I'll just leave the, you know, our contact details there if you want to follow up before I close in just a minute or so. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you at an event in the future, online or physically, perhaps in a slightly more distant future. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.